So one thing to note is that there is a field, a data element called current residence slash living situation, which we always train to that people should think of that as where was your client last night, right? Where was your client the day before they entered your project? So now this field is becoming prior living situation, which really speaks at, it's that much more blatant that we're trying to figure out where the client was before they entered your project. And then there's also the addition of current living situation, which we'll actually take a look at in the live site. It's a sub-assessment. It's done. It's going to effectively for street outreach and drop-in projects. It's going to be the way that you update your clients' locations. It's going to replace the outreach contacts that you have with your clients. So before, outreach projects may have had an outreach contacts section and that was what they had to complete in order to fulfill their needs for reporting. But now that has been replaced by current living situation. But also regular projects like emergency shelters, permanent housing, etc. You'll also have to fill this in for your clients. So everyone will have to touch this current living situation, but effectively, this current living situation is also important for street outreach and drop-in projects. And then another thing is that prior living situation, current living situation, and exit destination are going to have answers that are similar to each other. So the set of answers that are available for each of those three data elements are going to be very similar to each other so that there's not a diversion between, if a client said that their prior living situation was an emergency shelter, their exit destination, if they also went to another emergency shelter, it'll read exactly the same. So there's a consistency throughout. So again, one thing I wanted to mention is that this current residence slash living situation question will be becoming previous living situation. It's literally going to be replaced by that. And then sort of an additional thing that's going to be created for this question is current living situation. Prior living situations asking where was a client the day before. Current living situation is asking where's a client right now that you're talking to them or completing this assessment. So there's a time difference on the two of those. Think of prior as what happened before, the night before they entered your project. Current is where are they right now as I'm talking to them, either completing this assessment or um, either completing this assessment live or as I'm completing this paper assessment. So prior living situation is going to be linked to questions that ask about the client's housing situation. So the questions that are linked to prior living situation are length of stay in previous living situation, approximate date this episode of homelessness started, regardless of where they stayed last night, what is the number of times the client has been on the streets in emergency shelter or safe haven in the past 3 years, number of months homeless on the street, and typical sleeping arrangements, which are its own set of questions. So prior living situation is how we're still going to be figuring out what the client's chronicity is. So based on the time frame of their homelessness, uh, these questions guide us towards figuring out whether the time frame of homelessness warrants this client being considered chronically homeless. And then current living situation is interesting because be, because of the fact that it's so flexible in terms of the time frame, you may be checking in with your client every single day, and if the client's moving pretty consistently between family and the street, potentially every single one of those updates would be an update to that client's current living situation to show that they're sort of off and on homeless. So a current living situation doesn't necessarily lead to more conditional logic. It just leads to a major question asking where's this current client Lee? When was this current living situation uh, documented with the client? And then are they going to have to leave their current living situation within 14 days? Has the subsequent residence been identified? Do they have a support network or resources to obtain permanent housing? Have they had a lease or ownership interest in permanent housing in the last 60 days? And have they moved 2 or more times in the last 60 days? So again, one thing that I think is really interesting about these set of questions is that they're looking into 2 categories of housing situations that we don't necessarily ask many questions about. So it's category 2. There are 4 categories of homelessness, or rather housing crises. The first is literal homelessness. The second category is imminent risk of homelessness. The third is called federal statutes, but effectively it's sort of the closest definition that HUD has to being doubled up, to counting some of that population of doubled up clients. And then those that are the fourth category is that they are fleeing domestic violence. Here, these questions are linked almost directly to category 2, imminent risk of losing housing. And I know because it's asking whether or not the client has to leave their current situation within 14 days. And that category 2 is really asking, the requirements to meet that housing status is that the client has to have had notification that they have to be out of that property within 14 days, and that they don't have any subsequent residents yet identified. And the category 3, the special federal statutes, the way those work, if a client is considered category 3, then that client will not have had a lease or ownership interest in any type of permanent housing unit in the last 60 days. So that means if they haven't had a key, they're not on the lease with the landlord. It may be that they're just going there and they wait for their friend to get there every day so that the friend will let them in, etc. So that's sort of what that means. And then the fact that they have to have had moved at least twice within the last 60 days. So that leads towards that client being considered a category 3, which is effectively that they are sort of hopping around. They're doubled up. But again, it's not as vague, or I'm sorry, not as vague, but it is not as general as what we consider doubled up. It's not just to simply, this person is staying with their grandmother, this person is staying with another family member, or this family staying with another set of family members. It's not that. There's much more to that to prove this third category. So now let's go ahead and go into Service Point. Now, the provider that we're going to look at, the assessment that we're going to look at is an assessment that probably 75% of everyone in the system uses. We're going to look at the HUD COC and ESG All Other Projects assessment. Here we go. So you'll notice that everything will now have a parentheses 2020 Chicago. You should be seeing that 2020 Chicago. If you see anything about 2017, 2016, even 2015 we've been seeing, you'll want to let us know that that's there so we could update it for you. So again, everything should have a parentheses 2020 Chicago. That means that it was updated to the latest data standards for that particular intake. Now, things like the DFSS and IDHS supplemental or the HUD optional program specific elements assessments, those do not have a 2017 or 2020 indicator. Those are fine. Those are sort of these evergreen evergreen questions that we ask that aren't necessarily linked to HMI, that aren't linked to the data standards that we have to adhere to when submitting to HUD. So the All of the Projects 2020 Chicago assessment. This is all dummy data. So this is a fake client that we just answer pretty consistently for. We go back to Theo over and over again. But one thing I want to mention is that it's very similar. Up top, you'll notice right here that the italics, we have this disclaimer on top of everyone that anything in italics is optional. So you'll notice here, there aren't many optional questions, or rather, there is an optional question right here. Which of these sexual orientations best describes how you feel? So you know that that's optional. If we scroll down, you'll see some questions regarding employment. That is also optional. And then same for education and this pregnancy and parenthood right here. So if we scroll back up, you'll notice that we sort of break things out in sections. We have our client demographics, the date of birth, primary race, ethnicity, gender, etc. Then we start to ask about their domestic violence experiences. And after that, we move into prior living situations. So you'll notice that we sort of flipped it from how it was before. Housing status and then prior living situation are going to be right next to each other. And the additional questions regarding with a conditional logic is also here. And it's above our typically stay questions so that you can see all the changes that are happening. So let's say my client is in a place not meant for human habitation. There we go. And then I would answer these, where does the client typically stay? And again, this one is related to answering what the client's prior living situation was. And then once we move past that, we have our first new sub-assessment, which is current living situation. So let's look at what the current living situation is. And every agency has to answer for this. Now, this will play a more important role to street outreach and drop-in centers because this effectively replaces their outreach contacts. So for current living situation, when you click on add, you'll see that we're asking for a start date, for an information date, and then we have our current living situation here. So the idea is that if you're a street outreach project and you keep encountering your clients let me take that back. Let's say if you're at a drop-in center and you're working with a youth who has a pretty consistent, who doesn't have a consistent place to stay. So this client every time they come into your drop-in project, they're somewhere different. So maybe for a while they were in a place not meant for human habitation because they were sleeping on the CTA. But then the next week that they come in, they're now staying with a friend in a friend's room, apartment, or house. And then after that, the next week they come and they were in an emergency shelter separately. So this will help to sort of develop that pattern of where your client is going, where they're staying, what their patterns are for where they end up. And one thing you'll note here is that these questions are added. If yes, is the client going to leave their current living situation within 14 days? Answer the following questions, and then you would go through that if the client indicated to you that they would have to leave in 14 days. But also, obviously, the client may not know, the client may refuse, etc. And then we have living situation verified by. And so these codes, if you remember, they just represent what continuum you're a part of. So Chicago is IL 510. So you'll almost always be in IL 510, and we'll actually be updating that to inform you that it should be IL 510.